Now it's time to wire up the inverter. Of course, you'll need the 3500 watt 24 volt DC input power inverter. We've already got the red power cable assembly. We'll need the black 0 gauge inverter cable. We'll need a 3-prong plug from your local building supply store. And then you'll need a coil of 8 gauge wire. And lastly, we'll need one 10 gauge 1/4 inch stud ring terminal. The first thing we need to do is connect the chassis ground point on the inverter to a ground connection on the nearest electrical outlet in the garage. You'll need to measure the distance from the chassis ground point on the inverter to the nearest electrical outlet in your garage. And then have your local building supply store cut you a piece of stranded 8 gauge wire equal to that length. Now let's remove about a 1/2 inch of insulation from both ends of our 8 gauge stranded wire. Again, we'll use our wire cutters. Okay, let's do the second one. Okay. Now let's grab our ring terminal. I could not find any 8 gauge ring terminals at my local building supply store. Maybe you'll have better luck. However, this 10 gauge one will fit. It'll be a little bit snug, but it will fit over one end of our 8 gauge wire with a little bit of help. We'll grab our wire cutters, clamp down, and then we'll use our hammer. Make sure it's nice and tight. Okay, now let's grab our 8 gauge stranded wire and our 3-prong plug. Let's go ahead and remove the shell from our plug. And this particular plug, you need to slide it over the cable first. Now we're going to connect our wire to the ground connection point on the plug. Again, pay attention and do not connect the wire to any other point. Make sure you're connecting to the ground connection point on the plug. Now let's get our screwdriver and loosen the ground connection screw. Now let's get our wire and insert it into the ground connection point. And then tighten down the screw. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now we can replace the back shell. Okay. Now we can connect the end with the ring terminal to our chassis ground point on the inverter, and this end we can connect to our electrical outlet in the garage. Let's go ahead and plug this end into our electrical outlet. Now let's remove the nut that is on the chassis ground point of the inverter, and let's insert our ring terminal that's on the other end of the 8 gauge stranded wire. Replace the nut. We'll use a socket wrench to tighten it down a little bit more. Okay. Now let's ensure that the battery to inverter power disconnect switch is in the off position. We also want to disconnect the solar charge controller from the battery bank. So let's open circuit breaker number 2 by pushing down the red button. Now let's go down to the negative side of our 24 volt bank and let's remove one of the wing nuts. Now let's take our black 3-foot long 0 gauge power inverter cable, and we'll take the larger ring terminal end and connect it to the negative terminal and replace the wing nut. Tighten it down as snug as possible. Then we'll run the other end of the black power inverter cable to the negative terminal on the inverter. Then let's remove the nut from the negative input terminal on the inverter and remove the lock washer and the washer. And we will go ahead and insert the black inverter cable onto the negative terminal. Replace the washer, the lock washer, and the nut. Then use a wrench to tighten down the nut until it is nice and snug. Okay. Now let's go down to the 24-volt side of our battery bank. Let's remove one of the wing nuts. Then let's grab our 0 gauge power cable that's coming from our fuse box. And we're going to put it on this terminal. We may want to remove these and put our large ring terminal on the bottom, and then go ahead and replace these other ones on the top, just so that everything fits better. Then let's replace our wing nut. Tighten it down until it's nice and snug. Okay. Now let's remove the nut from the positive terminal of the input and the lock washer and washer. And let's go ahead and insert the red 0 gauge power cable coming from our power cable assembly. Replace the washer, lock washer, and nut. And then tighten down the screw with your wrench as tight as it will go. Okay. Before we switch our battery to inverter disconnect switch to the on position, let's double check everything. The black inverter cable should be connected to the negative end of our battery bank, and it should also be connected to the negative input terminal on the inverter. The red inverter power cable should be connected to the positive 24-volt end of the battery bank and up to the positive input terminal on the inverter. Now let's go ahead and replace the black and red protective caps over the positive and negative input terminals on the inverter. And then the red one over the positive input to the inverter. Okay. Now before we turn the disconnect switch on, let's make sure the inverter power button is in the off position. Now that we've double checked everything, we can go ahead and turn on the battery to inverter power disconnect switch. If you want, you can install the remote power on off switch. Here's the antenna, and then there's a little on off keychain. Again, this is purely optional. Now that everything has been double checked, let's go ahead and turn on the power switch on the inverter. Okay, looks like the green overload light is on, which means everything is working correctly. In a few more minutes, we'll cover the operation of your inverter. And don't forget to close circuit breaker number 2 so that power from the solar panels through the solar charge controller will reach the battery bank. Let's go ahead and flip up the yellow tab. Verify that our solar controller has started again. Okay. Now let's go ahead and reset the first circuit breaker. Congratulations! You have now wired up your simple, safe solar battery backup system for your home. This concludes the wiring up step-by-step section of the DVD. Now return to the main menu and select the final instructional video, How to Use Your System.